Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network, in 1939, on the 18th of October, President Roosevelt bans belligerent submarines from American ports and territorial waters. On the 20th of October, mass public executions of Poles begin in occupied Poland. In 1940, on the 16th of October, draft registration starts in the United States. On the 20th of October, Italian planes attack oil fields in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, and Heinrich Himmler meets Franco. In 1941, on the 14th of October, Ordnungspolizei Chief Kurt de Luega signs the order for the deportation of Berlin's Jews, and Italy starts planning for the occupation of Malta. On the 15th of October, the Soviets withdraw from Odessa. Most Soviet officials evacuate Moscow, but Stalin remains, and Germans say Jews found outside Polish ghettos will be executed. On the 18th of October, Hideki Tojo becomes a Japanese prime minister, and on the 19th of October, Stalin proclaims a state of siege in Moscow. In 1942, on the 15th of October, Japanese ships bombard American units on Guadalcanal. On the 16th of October, Allied leaders approve Operation Flagpole to secure the cooperation of Vichy officers in French North Africa. On the 17th of October, the Germans gain control of the Stalingrad tractor factory. On the 18th of October, Hitler issues the Commando order, which calls for the summary execution of captured members of special forces, and Vice Admiral William Horsey becomes commander of the South Pacific area. In 1943, on the 13th of October, the Italian government of Prime Minister Pietro Badoglio declares war on Germany. On the 14th of October, Jewish prisoners at the Sobibor extermination camp rebel. The US 8th Army Air Force loses 60 aircraft in an attack on Schweinfurt, and José Laurel becomes president of the Second Philippine Republic under Japanese control. On the 17th of October, the Burma Railway is completed. On the 18th of October, 1,007 Roman Jews are sent to Auschwitz. In 1944, on the 13th of October, the Allies liberate Athens. V-1 and V-2 flying bombs are launched at Antwerp. On the 14th of October, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel kills himself and is given a state funeral 4 days later. On the 15th of October, the Red Army captures Riga, capital of Latvia. On the 16th of October, the Red Army begins the Gumbinen operation to penetrate into East Prussia. The region of Hungary, Miklos Horthy, is replaced by Ferenc Szalasi of the Arrow Cross Party, and Albanian partisans liberate Vlore. On the 17th of October, the Battle of Leyte begins in the Philippines. On the 18th of October, the exiled Greek government returns to Athens, and Germany announces the creation of the Volkssturm militia. In 1945, on the 18th of October, prosecutors indict 24 top Nazis for war crimes. Well, there you are. We've gone through the key dates in the years 39 to 45, picking out some talking points that we're going to elaborate in this episode of This Week in the Second World War. And I'm now joined by my co-host, Joe Quinn. How are you doing, Joe? Hello, Joe.
I'm very well. How are you this evening?
Very good, Joe. Thanks very much for joining us again this week. This is the seventh episode of this series, going quite nicely, and we're progressing steadily through the conflict on covering all the years of the war and looking at the dates. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk through all the years.
Yes, well, there was, we discussed this before, there was this imperative to try and see if an alliance could be established with the other major fascist power in Europe, which was Franco's Spain. The only problem was, as previously discussed, and obviously we'll be covering the meeting that actually took place between Franco and Hitler in next week's episode, because the anniversary of the famous meeting. Hitler really loved having meetings and signing armistices and forging alliances, which involved basically meetings at railway sidings, whether at border areas or inside the terrain of other countries. So in this particular instance, you have a meeting that's set up at the junction of Hendaye, which is in southern France. And this is where Hitler and Franco will meet. But before all of this, in the week leading up to all of this, you have this whirlwind tour, which takes place where Himmler, Heinrich Himmler, who's a Reichsführer, so basically he's one of a number of basically leading, it's like 6-star generals basically serving under Hitler, and he's one of Hitler's closest acolytes among the particular cabal that surround Hitler. He's considered the truest of the true and the most trusted of Hitler's lieutenants. And he will meet Franco to establish three things. One, to set the groundwork for a meeting with Hitler so that an arrangement for some sort of formal or informal alliance between Franco's Spain and Hitler's Germany and also fascist Italy can be set up, so that there's a fourth power within the Axis, which also, by the way, will include Japan. And there's a key strategic imperative for this to happen. For starters, the British still possess a tiny enclave in southern Spain called Gibraltar, and this is a key nodal point in the British global military and naval infrastructure. This is a critical choke point for the British. It gives them access to the Mediterranean, and as well as basically onto Port Said and then into the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. It's key in this chain, shall we say, of keeping the sea lanes basically policed and protected. And without Gibraltar, the British would have faltered quite dramatically during the Second World War, and it's actually questionable whether British victory, without American help or without the help of other allies, would have been possible if they'd lost Gibraltar. Heinrich Himmler is really keen to see what can be done, and he's also very interested. There's a deeply personal reason for visiting Franco. Having supported Franco and supported Franco's nationalists in helping them to win the Civil War by supplying them with arms and ammunition. They supply them with German tanks. You will see in the historic city of Burgos in northern Spain, which was actually virtually and mercifully untouched by the Civil War. It was deep into nationalist terrain. It was actually a nationalist headquarters for a long time. Outside one of the main military barracks in central Burgos, near Burgos Cathedral, you actually, still to this day, you have a German Mark III Panzer tank, typical of the kind of tanks that they would have used during Operation Barbarossa during the invasion of the Soviet Union, and also was used in the Battle of France as well as in the invasion of Poland. And it's a classic example of a German tank. It's very distinctive, and it's still there to this day, right outside the front of that barracks. And it's just emblematic of the aid that the Germans in particular gave to Franco's nationalist army. And they also gave them aircraft as well. The Spanish Air Force is outfitted with the best in terms of German aircraft as well as Italian aircraft, but primarily they concentrate on getting the German stuff. It's high quality gear. And they're also supplied with other arms and equipment. So in return for this, Franco is basically plummosed, you might say, by Himmler in terms of, sort of having proven his mettle as a potential future fascist leader. And what Himmler wants to assess is to what extent Franco's Spain has actually fallen within the fascist framework of what a fascist state should look like. And actually, Himmler is taken on a tour of various different cultural sites, but he's also taken on a tour of concentration camps. So he gets to see one or two nationalist concentration camps where they are interning prisoners of war of the international brigades, as well as the anarchist and socialist, as well as communist brigades that served on the Republican side during the Civil War. And he is actually stunned, shocked by what he sees in those camps. He sees something which actually, even by the standards of Nazi German concentration camps, is quite extreme. And he actually counsels Franco to maybe not be as repressive as he is currently being, using this concentration camp system, which will eventually number somewhere in the order of 320 concentration camps throughout Franco's Spain throughout the course of the Second World War and after, where they say that thousands, if not tens of thousands, of opponents of the regime met their end. And there's mass graves all over Spain as a testament of this. So it's a very dark period in Spanish history. And Himmler actually briefly becomes an eyewitness to this particular process. And even though this is a system that he will eventually employ to detrimental effect upon the populations, the Jewish population and the Roma Gypsy population, anybody who's discovered to be homosexual under German rule, as well as millions of Catholics as well, and Russians who are exterminated through the Nazi German concentration camp system. It's kind of ironic to find Heinrich Himmler, of all people, appalled at what he sees in one of Franco's concentration camps.
Also, he's taken to a bullfight, apparently.
That's right.
And bizarrely, Himmler found it disgusting that animals should be tortured. And it says something about the Nazi ideology, which Himmler was a promoter of. They were environmentalists.
Yes.
They came from the American German romantic tradition. And they believe they're great believers in the power of nature. So that's why they came up with this idea of nature shaping humans through the survival of the fittest. And so he thought it was awful that human beings should torment poor animals. There are so many ridiculous absurdities to that. Now let's move on to 1940. And the thing I wrote down that we could discuss is Malta. So the Italians have announced that they're going to, or the Italians decide they want to take Malta. Why did Malta matter so much to the Italians and to the Allies? So there's a map of Malta, so you can see where it is. It's actually closer to Sicily than it is to Tunisia. Mm-hmm. And there you are. So why? Certainly the Italians were trying to besiege Malta eventually and force it to surrender. So why did the Italians expend so much effort and energy, and why did Britain spend so much time and effort preserving Malta?
The funny thing is that initially British investments in the defense of Malta, despite its importance, were quite minimal at the beginning. I mean, obviously they had very impressive naval facilities at Valletta and at a few other points around the island. And it's not just the island of Malta, it's also Gozo as well, the small island off to the northwest. And it's funny, actually, I visited Malta for the very first time with my girlfriend Rachel this year. I went there in May, and it was I was quite stunned to find myself landing at Malta airport at actually what was originally an RAF aerodrome. It was one of the main aerodromes on Malta. They had multiple. They had Cali, and where I was landing at was Lucca originally, and there were one or two others on the island. I think there were three main ones, but there might have been one or two other satellite fields. But these were key airfields and aerodromes during the siege of Malta that initially were not very well outfitted or equipped with anything by way of first-line air defenses. Malta becomes this horrendous saga in terms of basically, British underinvestment in terms of air defense. And they do defend the island quite considerably in terms of naval defenses, and they build up quite considerable naval defenses, and it's important that they do that, because even though it's very proximate to Sicily and to the Italian mainland, and is under fire pretty much constantly from mid to late 1940, after the Italians enter the war, even though it's under pretty much almost continuous harassment in one form or another, attempts to basically bomb the harbour with pigmen, or basically Italian underwater divers, naval forays in the area around Malta, and also, more importantly, air activity and crucially bombing activity. Malta eventually becomes, particularly the city of Valletta, becomes the most bombed location on the planet Earth during the Second World War, and possibly in the whole of human history, in terms of the long history of military aviation. Military warfare, and in the short history of military aviation, Valletta certainly is in the Guinness Book of Records as taking more of a pounding than any other location officially. In terms of the Italians made a concentrated effort to try and blast the island into submission, but their attempts, even though their air force was actually quite capable and quite competent, and they did have some for their day, they had some fairly decent kit. They had at least one bomber that was up to the challenge of carrying a certain amount of certain quantity of explosive in order to do damage at various different sites, and they also had some fairly effective fighters as well. The fact of the matter is that the Italians weren't able to coordinate a more effective air strategy over Malta, which would actually bring the island into submission. And eventually, when the Germans got involved in the Mediterranean campaign, and particularly when they were involved in North Africa, the Germans had to lend a hand, and suddenly an Italian air effort to basically blast the island into submission became a joint Italian-German operation, and eventually led by the Germans, where the Germans are basically bombing Malta night after night after night. And it becomes evident that the British need to up their air defenses, and this is something that we will see right throughout in our episodes. We'll see how Malta is outfitted with more anti-aircraft defenses, the garrison is increased, the Royal Naval presence becomes slightly larger, and also bear in mind that Malta is one of the main Mediterranean headquarters for the Royal Navy, and it remains a key headquarters for the Royal Navy right throughout the entire siege of Malta, and it does become a siege. And there's extreme rationing, and there's a point at which the population of the island, which by then I think was probably something just a little bit less than 250,000, maybe approaching 200,000, coming up towards 250,000. Currently, the population of the island of Malta is just under 500,000. So for a tiny little island, the Maltese population is actually quite considerable. And also, the last point I would make is to do with the Maltese war effort. The Maltese have a similarity in terms of ethnicity and language to the Italians, but they are not Italian. They don't identify as such. There might be certain Maltese citizens back during the Second World War that might have been suffused by Italian nationalism, might have been inspired by figures like Garibaldi, and might have seen themselves as part of a greater Italian homeland. But most Maltese don't really buy into that. They see themselves as quite distinct. Most modern Maltese you would meet nowadays would actually admit very freely that they have more in common with Arabic the peoples of North Africa and the Middle East, than they do with the Italians. There's somewhat a quasi-culture caught between the two. They're sort of a remnant of a population that would have inhabited those islands effectively under Islamic rule, and they do not deny that. So there are very distinct differences between the Maltese and the Italians, and as a result, the Maltese really lend they put their backs into the war effort, and there's probably something in the order of about maybe 50 to 60,000 Maltese enrolled in Britain's armed forces, like very considerable numbers, as well as the Maltese population, which really do pitch in to basically to effectively bolster Britain's effort to protect the island and keep that territory within the Commonwealth and within the Allied side during the war. And I think without that cooperation, Malta wouldn't have been able to hold out for as long as it did.
No, and there's some history. So the question is, what the hell? Because Malta at this point was a crown colony, had the status of Hong Kong. So it wasn't a dominion, it was a crown colony. And it became part of the British system in 1800. Around the time of Nelson. I'm saying that to all our Royal Naval watchers, because Nelson, in 1798, famously defeated Napoleon's fleet of Egypt, and then he went to Naples, where he carried out a very interesting double job, one of suppressing the Republican forces in Naples, and the other one is establishing a very close and intimate relationship with the wife of the British ambassador to Naples, the Kingdom of Naples, Emma Hamilton. Now, at that point, there was a question in London, in the Admiralties, whether Sicily should actually be taken by the British. That was a plan. And in fact, the King of Sicily, who was based in Naples, because at that point there was a Kingdom of Sicily, which is all of southern Italy plus Sicily. At that point, he was so impressed by Nelson, he gave Nelson an estate in Etna called Bronte. And so Nelson became the Duke of Bronte, never actually went there. Yeah. But if you go to Bronte today, there is a castle called Nelson's Castle, and it's got the largest collection of Nelson memorabilia in the world. Yeah. And you get there, it's got paintings, all the artifacts, include the glass he drank when he was at Trafalgar, because it was occupied by not Nelson's family, because he didn't have any children, but by people who inherited the estate. And another interesting aspect of this story, because I've been to Sicily a bit, is that Emily Bronte, her real name is Bronte, because her father was a vicar from Ireland. He was called the Reverend Bronte, and Reverend Bronte was so taken by Nelson, he took the name Bronte.
Bronte, yeah, changed it to Bronte. And actually, Bronte. Yeah, Nelson actually, one of the things I would say is that Nelson did have children. He had at least one child. He had a daughter by Emma Hamilton, and actually, I
don't think she counted because she's not illegitimate.
Well, yeah, I know. Thankfully, we live in more civilized times. But the thing was that it actually gave, and one of the things he wanted to do very much was pass the name, because he took the name. He called himself Nelson O'Bronte, and he wanted to pass the name to his daughter. But I wanted to just say, getting back to Second World War related topics, the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, who was Admiral Cunningham, there were two Cunningham brothers from Dublin, Southern Irish Protestants.
Yes,
a little bit of a history lesson for our English cousins. Two brothers from Dublin played very prominent parts during the Second World War. You had Alan Cunningham, who was a general who ended up becoming the last governor of Mandate Palestine in Jerusalem, and also was a very reasonably effective British commander, fighting against Mussolini's forces in Italian Somaliland, and ultimately helping to defeat Mussolini's forces, who were completely cut off effectively in Ethiopia. They were occupying Ethiopia. So he was the East African campaign, it's known as, and he was a very effective commander in that. It was the height of fame really for him as a military commander. But his brother, who was known as ABC, so that was I think it was Arthur Brown Cunningham, was it?
Arthur Cunningham.
Yeah. He would rise after the death of Dudley Pound. He would eventually rise to become First Sea Lord. Yeah. And he was arguably the most effective naval commander of the Second World War. James Holland is a massive fan of his. And while Cunningham was on Malta, he very much tried to follow, and this is where Nelson comes in, a Nelsonian philosophy about how to defeat a naval adversary and how to win a naval war in the Mediterranean, which was very interesting. He was a great student of Nelson, admired him greatly, and he very much applied the dogma of Nelson in terms of how he prosecuted the war in the Mediterranean, which is probably one of the reasons why he was so successful.
Yes, and of course Malta, once Sicily was taken, Malta became the headquarters. I think Alexander was based there. Very important from a strategic and logistical point of view. So Malta, this little island with only 500,000 people there, it is an European Union state. And of course, the legacy, when I first went there, it was run by the Mintoffs, Don Mintoff, who was very, very anti-British. My uncle was based there. He's in the Navy. He was based there for 15 years, as was Queen Elizabeth of Prince Philip before she succeeded the throne. So
the happiest years of her life, apparently, according to what she said.
Yeah. You know, so there's a lot going in Malta. If you know, and the other thing is, you are quite right. The Sicilians, I know, some of them had never been to mainland Italy, but they had been to Malta. So you could take a boat over to Malta. And the language they tell me of the Maltese, it's got some elements of Sicilian. It's a Siciliano.
Yeah. It would. If you listen to it, it's a very, very. It sounds like some type of Italian dialect. You can certainly.
I don't think Italians can understand it, because a lot of Italians can't understand Sicilian.
Also a very Catholic culture as well on Malta, even still to this day.
It is the attempt to revive the Sicilian language, a bit like in Ireland, revive the Irish language.
I'm not sure. By the way, I'm not sure I'd be so gone on the food on Malta.
Okay, well let's stick to the good news. The Sicilian language has been revived, but the people who tend to speak it now tend to be the educated people, tend to be the university graduates, not the ordinary people who speak essentially Tuscan Italian, which is the language of Italy, which was imposed upon them after the unification. Anyway, we could go on all the day about this, and I wanted to talk about one other change in 1940, and that's Tojo becomes Japanese prime minister. Now, this ends very sadly for everybody, because he is hanged for war crimes in 1946, I believe. But tell us why him become prime minister really was an important moment in the Second World War.
Well, I'll touch upon this point very briefly, because we do need to move on. So it's basically Tojo becoming, on the 18th of October, the Japanese premier, is... you could argue that it's one of the greatest catastrophes in Japanese history. And certainly the heads of the Navy, particularly Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, recognizes as such, because effectively what it means is, in the great struggle between the Army and Navy, which is a perpetual rivalry and a perpetual struggle, which the Navy quite justifiably feels it should really be the top dog at this particular table, not necessarily because of seniority of service, but because of the importance of the service. Without the Japanese Navy, you cannot have the Japanese Empire. You can't run the empire, and you can't move the army all around in order to win this, all these victories that they're going to win. And it's coordination between the army and Navy, which is crucial in the opening 6 months of the Japanese campaign in the Far East, South Pacific, in the the Western Pacific theater, and all around, and also like in China and different other areas, and Indochina as well. It is the logistical support that is enabled by the Navy that makes those victories possible. You have to give credit to the Army for being efficient and effective with limited resources, and also thinking outside the box, particularly invading Malaya and Singapore on the back of a bicycle, effectively, which is what basically about 1/3 Japanese troops would ultimately do in the lead up to the surrender of Singapore on the 15th of February 1942. But leaving all that to one side, the Army was and ought to have been a subordinate partner in this particular arrangement. It might have been larger than the Navy in terms of personnel, but it definitely wasn't as important. The Navy was more technologically advanced. It represented the cream of what the Japanese military and naval establishment had to offer. And also, arguably, some of the greatest talent within the Japanese armed forces was retained within the Navy. They had the best air aces, some of the best air aces that Japan had to offer. Their military aviation, or the naval aviation to be more specific, was considerably more sophisticated. And they were quite pioneering in terms of their creation of, in terms of submarine warfare, and also in terms of carrier warfare as well as basically providing a ferry service for the army. And what Hideki Tojo effectively does when he becomes prime minister, and it's at the end of a long campaign, a long battle by the militarists to wrest power from the civilian-led establishment, some of whom have military backgrounds, but the bottom line is it's still a largely civilian government. And the military basically overruled the Diet, that's the Japanese parliament, and they also gradually insert themselves within the Japanese cabinet and eventually the war cabinet. And it's only a matter of time before the army will topple the Japanese Prime Minister Konoe, who's later appointed as the envoy to Washington. And this is an absolute disaster, because it effectively means that any reasonable voices in terms of Japanese militarism and military aggression, which they are increasingly showing at this particular time towards the United States and towards European powers that are based in the Far East. It means that there is no middle ground. It means that the paths of negotiation become thinner and thinner. And while Japanese negotiators, particularly the Japanese ambassador in Washington, is trying to deal with leading members of the United States government, Cordell Hull, who is the Secretary of State for the United States, representing Roosevelt. Cordell Hull spends a huge amount of time trying to avert a conflict by directly negotiating with the Japanese, and it leads to long efforts basically to conclude some form of an agreement whereby the Japanese interests, in other words, their supplies of oil that they were getting from the United States and other raw materials that they need in order to maintain their newly acquired imperial territories, as well as maintain their war of conquest. They're looking for increasingly to the United States to give them those supplies. And when the United States places an embargo in protest against their invasion of China, or their aggression on the Chinese mainland, as well as their invasion of territories in Indochina, basically the clock starts ticking. And under this pressure, the militarists managed to basically crush civilian authority within the Japanese government, and they insert themselves directly before the emperor, to whom they're all ultimately answerable. The Japanese emperor retains supreme authority over the government. It must be remembered. It's a little bit unlike the system in the United Kingdom, where the monarch is a symbolic figurehead who's only required to sign the laws. The Japanese emperor still has a great deal of reserved power, but he refuses to intervene in certain matters. He needs to allow his government to function. But the Japanese emperor is essentially forced to deal directly with the army as represented by Tojo. And when he becomes prime minister in October 1941, the gloves come off, and the Navy are told that this plan that they've been asked to put together to launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbour is a prelude to launching a series of surprise attacks all across Asia and the Far East in order to seize these territories in lightning advances. They are told that they have to act upon these orders and get ready to go within a matter of weeks, not months, weeks. So it is very clear, and as we now know, the date is December 7th, 1941. It's very clear that by the time Tojo becomes premier of Japan, it's very clear that this is not something that's a far off, distant possibility. This is actually going to be an immediate reality for the Japanese. And for people like Yamamoto, who have a realistic appreciation of what it'll actually mean to take on the United States and the great industrial base of the United States, as well as its sheer manpower, he knows that at very best they can play havoc with them for a year, to quote him, to paraphrase him. But after that, all bets are off. He knows that this is not a war that they will be able to win. And so, but for people like Tojo, that's beside the point. They want a war, and they want it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I'm very. A member of my family is an African American, and he, I mean, he's gone now, but he served in the Merchant Marine. He used to say, "God bless Tojo." He said that because by starting the war, it created lots of economic opportunities for African Americans.
Yes.
So he used to say, it was his perverse sense of humor, God bless Tojo, but he was disastrous for Japan and himself. Anyway, let's look at 1942. The point it's the Americans are starting to make overtures to the Vichy French. Now, let's get the dates right. So here we are. It's October 42, as everybody knows. Operation Torch, the landings in Morocco and Algeria, they start in the 8th, 9th of November. So we're within a month. The plans have already been laid. So Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed there would be a landing in Northwest Africa. That was already decided, had been decided almost a year before. It's the first thing that was decided when Churchill and Roosevelt met at the end of 1941, about 2 weeks after America came to the war. So they already decided they were going to land in Casablanca. So the Americans knew this was going on and what they were doing. So the interesting thing is the Americans still had diplomatic relations with Vichy France. So they had a representative in Vichy, and that was Mr. Murphy, who was very close, another Irish American, close to Roosevelt. And he was working behind the scenes, trying to persuade, identify Vichy officers who he felt could collaborate with America and the British once the landing started. And that was what the hope was. And the people, there's two key characters in this, and I just are this. Now, on the left, the one with the splendid moustache was Henry Giraud. Henry Giraud had been taken prisoner by the Germans. He was in the prisoner of war camp and he had escaped. And he had been identified, I'm sure, with the American involvement as someone that the Americans could deal with. So he was smuggled out of France and went to Gibraltar, where he met Eisenhower just before the start of Operation Torch. Mm-hmm. And the plan was Giraud was going to be brought in. He was going to be declared to be the High Commissioner, effectively the French government in North Africa, this whole large area, the protectorate of Morocco, the protectorate of Tunisia and metropolitan Algeria. He was the man, and the Americans were pleased, and they thought they could work with him. Now, the man on the right, however, spoiled all that. That's Admiral Darlan. Admiral Darlan, unlike Giraud, Admiral Darlan was a clear collaborator. He had been part of the Vichy system, and he had a very senior rank, and he had, coincidentally, he went to Algeria about a week before the landings were due to start. And when the Americans landed, the Vichy French fought. Mark Clark had been landed before the landings, and he was Eisenhower's deputy, and he had met French officers in Algeria to persuade them not to fire on the Americans, who still had full diplomatic relations with Vichy. America had not declared war on Vichy France, whereas the British, of course, had. Not the British had, but the British didn't recognize Vichy France. So in the event, Darlan took over, and to everybody's disgust, Darlan, the man on the right, in return for being declared to be the High Commissioner of French North Africa, he secured that commitment. He stopped the war, and therefore not Giraud, but Darlan was the man who got the job. But of course, what happened very conveniently is that Darlan was assassinated around Christmas 1942, thereby disposing of this rather embarrassing collaboration, his Vichy character, and allowing Giraud to take over. Of course, in due course, he in turn was displaced by de Gaulle. As you discussed before, the Americans were not keen on de Gaulle at all, didn't have anything to do with him. But it shows you how complicated the political maneuverings are. And one of the things I can't help noticing is that the film Casablanca, one of the greatest films ever made, set in Casablanca, which is one of the places, of course, the Americans captured in Operation Torch in the first few days. It's a story about an American who at that point isn't at war, trying to persuade the French policemen to abandon Vichy and join our side. And, they eventually killed a German. And it always struck me as being one hell of a coincidence that Hollywood should make a film about Casablanca, which was released literally the week after, 2 weeks after, a month after Casablanca the actual torch landings are. And there's always been a close relationship between Hollywood and the American government. So a lot of the films that you see, the Hollywood films, you think are very entertaining. You can go through a list of them, but actually serve a propaganda purpose. And I have often wondered, I can't believe, because the truth is, I think all the accounts is that Vichy knew. I mean, people in Vichy knew weeks before the torch landing it's going to happen. It was not a big secret in Vichy. And I can only conclude the Germans must have known something as well. So there's a lot of this, cloak and dagger work going on in these months, particularly with these countries which are supposedly neutral. I mean, Turkey was playing all sorts of games.
Yeah.
Neutral. But anyway, that's anything to say about this?
Yeah, I mean, well, just very briefly. I mean, I think that was quite deliberate. I don't think that was accidental. I mean, maybe they got lucky when they came across the story and script for Casablanca, and obviously you got Humphrey Bogart. It's like, I mean, one of the most iconic films of all time, even today, at a time when 1930s and 1940s cinema is becoming progressively more and more forgotten. Casablanca is still one of these films that still stands out. It's still one of these iconic movies. Bogart staring into the pretty face of Ingrid Bergman at the time, who herself was Swedish from a neutral country, and you have Claude Rains, with a sort of my favorite scene in that movie is basically where the policeman played by Claude Rains basically blows his whistle and decides to shut down the bar basically and just get everybody out, just to basically keep the Germans quiet, because they're a bit annoyed about the fact that I can't remember the name of the resistance leader. He's this anonymous kind of resistance leader. I think he's meant to be a Czechoslovak patriot who's kind of connecting this sort of European and international resistance. It's a kind of transnational anti-Nazi resistance. He becomes a figure. He's a hero for the French, and he's a hero for everybody, and he's sort of a mover and shaker. He's moving around all the time, basically trying to influence against the Nazis. And he strikes up the Marseillaise when a group of German officers are singing in the bar or whatever, singing some musty old German, beer house, basically.
Well, the great political statement in the film is right at the end, when the Claude Rains character, by the way, in the First World War, is in the London Scottish Regiment.
Yes. Yeah.
He picks up the bottle of Vichy water and he throws it in the bin.
Throws it into the bin,
What a coincidence. Just with reference to the great Diane Keaton, who's just passed.
Mm-hmm.
She was starred with Woody Allen in Woody Allen's famous honorific to Casablanca, Play It Again, Sam.
That's right. I was just going to make the point that Rains is a kind of a corrupt character. Like, there's a bit where he's, I'm shocked to find out that gambling is going on here, and then a waiter comes up to him with a deck of chips, a deck of chips, and he goes, "You're winning, sir." "Oh, thank you very much." And then he blows his whistle and closes down the bar. I think there's a lot of things that are going on in that movie. I think the timing of the release of the movie, with the liberation of Casablanca, and also following very quickly from that, the Casablanca Conference, which follows from that, with Churchill and Roosevelt and de Gaulle there and whatever. It's a whole load of things going on, and becomes a symbolic thing. Casablanca as a city, as a sort of an iconic movie, all of this. It's all. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think
I find it very difficult to believe.
It becomes symbolic of a turning of the tide.
Yeah, it is. And also
the common cause, the victory symbol, everything like that. And one other point. Sorry.
At the end, the Bogart character Rick, he goes off to Congo Brazzaville.
That's right. Yeah, they moved to another
part of the French West African territories, which were in the hands of the Free French. So there's a lot of clues and hints in the film. Anyway, I don't want to go on about it too much.
Well, there is one last point that I would make, which is why Casablanca is also significant. They're about to launch Torch. One of the things that's happening on the other side of the world is you have, going back to our conversation about Guadalcanal, 15th of October, Japanese ships bombard American units on Guadalcanal. This is the first time that the Japanese Navy have they've won the Battle of Salvo Island. which is basically, and driven the United States Navy away from Guadalcanal. This is what results in the death of the Sullivan brothers. They die when basically one of the ships in the American Navy basically blows up a big fireball. And what happens is the American Navy basically, I think it's Turner, he basically heads for open sea and gets the hell out of Dodge. And the Japanese Navy basically for the next month or so control the waters around Guadalcanal, and they start intensively a naval shelling of the pocket of U.S. Marines around Henderson Field. And they continue to do it almost night after night, basically bombarding these units dug in on the ground. So they're coming under very intense naval gunfire, and they're being bombed from Japanese bombers coming from Morbol. And it doesn't seem like they're getting a huge amount of naval support. This is because, in Casablanca, what happens is the Allied leaders agree, and military commanders, they agree a Europe first policy, which is crucial to winning the Second World War, which means that although they're making an effort in the Pacific, they're going to prioritize as much resources as possible, which at that point are limited, towards starting to win a series of victories. And they're going to begin with North Africa and then take the Mediterranean. So they actually have to withdraw naval, particularly, sort of amphibious, like landing craft, Higgins boats, whatever, all these various different things that are coming online, which are in short supply. They have to withdraw them temporarily from the Pacific while Guadalcanal is under siege and move them into the Atlantic so they can quickly land their forces in North Africa, meet up with their British allies on the other side of North Africa, Montgomery charging across after the Battle of El Alamein, and then basically joining in the middle in Tunisia, and then move everything back so that they can renew their advances. So it's basically there's a bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul going on in October 1942.
Good. Well, let's move on to 43. And the thing I've highlighted is that I think it's the Black Sunday raid. So this is October 43, the attack on Schweinfurt. Now, I'll help you here because if I can put it up, yes, I can. There you are. That's Germany's is the day. Of course, at the time, Germany encompassed Lorraine and Alsace and practically everything to the west of that map. But Frankfurt, as you can see, Schweinfurt is right in the middle of Germany. So tell us a little bit about this raid, Joe, and why it matters.
The Schweinfurt raid was a raid in 1943 that essentially caused the US 8th Air Force to reevaluate their tactics. There was poor morale within the 8th Air Force at around this particular time. They had started to commit themselves to a daylight bombing campaign. And the problem with attacking Schweinfurt is if you just look at the map, if you're able to bring the map up very quickly.
I'll get this on.
Yeah, no worries. I'll just point out what the immediate problem is. So, fighter escort for a flight of, let's say, maybe between 200 and 300 B-17 bombers, or perhaps also joined by B-24s. There are 3 air divisions located in England throughout the Second World War. These are kind of like almost like military air divisions, but they're airborne units. And every B-17 and B-24 is crewed by 10 people. So basically, you lose one of those planes, you lose about 10 people. So when you're talking about 60 aircraft loss, that's a loss of about, there you go. It's basically you multiply that by the 10 crew members on the bomber. So it's a considerable loss. It's a loss in hundreds. And the reason they're sustaining such losses is because, do you know how far the fighter escort gets currently at this particular point in the war? If they're getting an escort at all? I'll point it out to you on the map. The furthest extent of a fighter escort at this particular point of the war is if you draw a line between Munster and Hanover. That's basically as far as they can go into Germany. This is the current state of basically fighter aviation within the US 8th Air Force. They don't yet have enough bombers. They have P-47 Thunderbolts, which can go so far, particularly if they equip them with drop tanks, but they're not actually very effective at high altitude fighter escort. They improve over time and become more and more powerful. But at this particular point in the war, they're most effective as a fighter bomber. It's not that they're completely ineffective as fighters, but they are, they're bulky, they're awkward, and they just don't have the rate of climb that you need. And it's going to take some time before they get the right escort fighter online, which we now know is the P-51 Mustang, which, it exists. Variants of the Mustang exist. They're used by the British. The British are the reason why the Mustang was invented in the first place, or created. It's a hybrid between an American designed and made airframe equipped with American 50 caliber machine guns, but using a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which again is zooped up and becomes more and more powerful. But a purpose-built escort fighter to get those bombers across Germany safely and escort them the entire way and back again is what is needed. And what Schweinfurt demonstrates is basically a rate of attrition doing deep raids into southern Germany. Schweinfurt is a major military industrial complex site, like Regensburg, like, there's various different other sites in southern Germany. And these are crucial to the production of one key target for the American Air Force, which is sites for building the components of Me-109 for escort fighters. So this is a key target. They want to knock out the sites of production to slow the production of German fighters that are taking on the Americans in the sky. They're actually trying to directly take on the source of production of the kit that their adversaries are equipped with, which is causing such a high loss rate. And it's causing great despair within the 8th Air Force. These missions, these daylight missions, are considered by American Air Force pilots in the 8th Air Force, within the bomber groups, to be suicidal. And Hap Arnold is not particularly happy with it. And the only way they're keeping the campaign going is by having ruthless types like a certain colonel. He later became the head of the U.S. Air Force, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm just trying to think of his name. He was in command of the American Air Force units bombing Japan. Sorry, you're muted.
I can know his face because he was there in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And
Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay was a colonel in the 8th Air Force, in the United States Army Air Force at that time, before they decided to make him a general and send him out to the Pacific to basically raise all of Japanese cities to the ground. Curtis LeMay, the reason he became so effective within the Air Force and was bumped up to command a whole Air Force by himself was because when he was in England with the 8th Air Force, he was absolutely ruthless. You had a 20% abort rate among American bomber crews, because that's how high the death rate was. They were approaching, on some missions, 40 to 50% of their bomber formations been blown out of the sky. That's basically 25% of the force that they were sending over killed, and the other 25% captured. It was absolutely nuts, and it was like, a lot of these lads were going insane. So you had 20% of the units within Curtis LeMay's group were basically aborting their missions, reporting technical errors, reporting engine trouble, and all sorts of problems with their oxygen tanks, and all sorts of issues like that. And they were pulling out, and he correctly suspected that they were just basically making this up as an excuse to turn back.
Yeah, sure. It's not the first time.
And he brought in a system of court-martialing these air personnel, and basically this 20% rate dropped to less than 2% virtually overnight.
Yeah. And we can have a discussion about what was the most effective strategy. I saw a discussion recently from a British historian who argued, in fact, the British tactics. So the British were doing nighttime raids, so they could fly lower, they could fly slower, but they were less accurate. And the British did have doctrinally a strategy of demoralizing the opponents, including the Italians. The Americans
very quickly, I just wanted to say that the difference between the British bombing doctrine and the American bombing doctrine was summarized in my textbook when I was in secondary school, my Leaving Cert textbook. What I remember the quotation was the British thought that the Americans were insane to bomb by day, whereas the Americans thought the British were criminal to bomb by night. But the truth about it is that by the end of the war, ironically, the British were actually bombing their targets more accurately than the Americans were bombing by day.
At night time. Yeah, exactly. We'll come back to that because this is a really contentious issue. And of course, the consequences for everybody was really substantial. For those of you, I like referring to popular culture. So watch 12 O'Clock High with Gregory Peck, which captures the psychology that was apparent in American flyers who were based in Britain. Anyway, so let's move on quickly to 1944. We're running out of time. One of the talking points of 1944, of course, is the return of the Greek government. So Greece had been invaded and occupied by the Germans and the Italians in 1941. By 1940, this point in 1944, so we're talking about October, the Germans decided it wasn't worth defending, it's too difficult, so they pulled out. They abandoned Athens. And so the royal family and the government came back to Athens to restore government. And then we had in this month also the liberation, as we say, the liberation of Athens, to the extent the country, Athens, had been occupied. Now, this actually set the scene for the Greek Civil War, because the most effective anti-German, anti-occupation forces were nearly always LS, the communist groups, and then Britain had determined to restore the Greek royal family, because of course LS and the communists wanted to get rid of they wanted to get rid of the monarchy, they wanted a republic, and they wanted to turn it into a communist state. And of course, the byproduct of that decision by Britain, and we'll come on to it, is that in the winter of 1944, forces were taken out of the Italian campaign to go and stabilize Greece. They took forces out to make sure that the communists didn't take over in Greece. So you have this political undertone going on while the war was going on. And curiously, there was a Greek brigade in the 8th Army that was fighting under British command. It wasn't sent to Greece because they were pretty strongly conservative, monarchist, and probably couldn't be trusted to behave themselves if they got into Greece. And so it was done by British and Indian troops who helped stabilize it. And of course, the Civil War went on for several years after the war. Another family connection, my uncle was in the Royal Navy at the end of the war. He was based in Malta. He spoke fluent Russian, actually. But he was intelligence, and he was sent out to Greece. And the last person to shoot at him during the conflict at any point, because he was shot at several times during the war, were Greek communists as he went out doing his reconnaissance. So, right, that's anything else to say about 44? I mentioned Hungary, but the
Rommel.
Erwin Rommel. I am very sorry. We're going to talk about Erwin now. If you can, in a couple of minutes, summarize, what's history's judgment on this man now. Because again, a popular film, the Desert Fox film with Mason, fantastic film, but obviously romanticizing this guy. What's the truth now?
Well, the truth about it is that Rommel was part of, sort of a kind of a slight Wehrmacht bodyguard for Hitler at the beginning of the war. He was very, very close to Hitler. He was became a darling of Hitler. So he very much enjoyed Hitler's patronage. He was at Hitler's side when Hitler went in to visit Poland. We talked, I think, last week about Hitler reviewing a victory parade in Warsaw. Well, guess who was sort of in his inner circle, basically bunched around him on the stand while he was taking the salute from passing Wehrmacht units? It was none other than Erwin Rommel, who at this point was a very junior sort of officer, like a brigadier general almost at this particular point. He was also in the railway carriage at Compiègne when the armistice was signed, I think. I'm not too sure. He was kind of roving between being a staff officer and being a field officer, so that he kind of was moving around. It was kind of crazy. He was in so many places at so many different times. It almost doesn't really seem to add up in those early years. But he was given a field command in the Battle of France in 1940 and demonstrated his competence to a great degree. And really, it's in North Africa that he begins to shine, shows his prowess in terms of commanding armored and motorized units and attacking the Allies at great speed and using effectively numerically inferior forces to constantly outflank and outmaneuver. He's obviously bolstered by the Italians that are actually able to bring more to bear in North Africa, and he's a very effective what you might call a coalition commander. So it's under his command and under his leadership that the Italians actually begin to become effective in the North African campaign. But without their German allies, they're really at a loss. They've suffered huge defeats at the hands of the British Eighth Army, which was then numerically inferior to them. And the Italians ultimately lose about 1 million men killed but mainly captured by the British in 1940 and 1941. And what happens really there's a back and forth seesaw thing, which we will cover in upcoming episodes, where Rommel is basically outmaneuvering and outwitting the British. But what ultimately happens is it's basically the closing up of the supply lines because of Malta. Malta is really the thing that really kills Rommel in the end, because it's the British continued presence on Malta and their ability to actually attack and interdict basically the sea lanes from Italy to North Africa that are keeping Rommel and his Italian allies supplied, which ultimately leads to them basically having fewer resources with which to fight the British, who are getting stronger and stronger, ultimately resulting in the Battle of Alamein, which the anniversary of which we'll be discussing, I think, in next week's episode. But what happens really, what leads to Rommel's downfall, just to keep a long story short, is that Rommel is brought back into command in the Western theatre of Europe when just before the invasion of Normandy, and he's charged with getting France prepared and the Atlantic Wall prepared for a defence for the forthcoming invasion. He actually suspects that the invasion will happen at Normandy. It's a site that he would have identified as the most logical place for the Allies to land, not the Pas de Calais, because it's too close, too much logistical pressure coming from the Germans. If you land there, Normandy is way more suitable, and he's effectively in charge of the commanding the defense of Normandy, and he's crowding as much armor and as much manpower as he can to basically corralling the Allies that are expanding their bridgehead. And in July, he at a briefing, he lets it slip that by this particular date, the Allies may well be in Paris. He makes it a joke out of it, and then he drives off. And the date that he cited was the date at which von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators made an attempt on the life of Adolf Hitler in the Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg, East Prussia, which is one of a number of things, including his associations with conspirators against Hitler. And he's found out because of this. He's not directly involved in the plot, but he's seen as a sort of an outside patron of an attempt to remove Hitler, and his own disgruntlement with Hitler, his quiet disgruntlement, is made known. And ultimately what ends up happening is his home in Bavaria, can't remember exactly where his home was, but essentially Eddie?
I think he's from Württemberg,
Württemberg, he's Baden-Württemberg, that from about that area.
BMWs come from.
He's the son of the former Chamberlain of the King of Baden-Württemberg, or the local ruler. So he's he's kind of blue-blooded. But his residence, his private home, is surrounded by SS forces and two leading officers. I think one of them was one of Hitler's staff generals basically is present at this meeting in his home, where he's more or less told that he has to do the honorable thing and take his own life, or else he and his wife and his son and anybody else connected with them, aides that are present in the household, will all be murdered, and that their house is surrounded, and he has a short amount of time with which to make his decision, and he's driven off, informs his family of what's going to happen before he leaves, says goodbye to them, and he's driven off somewhere, and he's given a cyanide pill with which to take his own life. And he's given this huge, like what I would say is a monstrous, horrific state funeral, a real pagan affair with all these Germanic crosses and with torches by one side. And if you look at the newsreel footage of the Guard of Honor standing beside, it's very grim and very frightening. It's kind of like something out of a Dracula film. It was a horrific way for him to go, and I think the post-war film involving James Mason was an attempt to redeem him. It was anti-Soviet propaganda,
yes,
largely, but the thing about it is it was clearly an attempt to redeem Rommel as this honourable German. And
the whole officer class,
yes,
the German officer class, because quite a lot of the Wehrmacht senior officers became NATO officers.
Yes.
And I met Rommel's son, Manfred, believe it or not.
What's he like?
I don't know if he still is, but I remember meeting him. We were talking, but I just couldn't get over it. Hello, Mr. Rommel. Anyway, there's a lot of detail there. I think people agree that he was a kind of good divisional commander, maybe, but getting up to the corps level or an army, he wasn't effective. And he had a tendency to drive everybody who's interfering, and he didn't sleep, and he was just constantly on the go. And the consequence, he had a lot of sickies.
Yeah.
He had a lot of sickies. Well, actually, quite a lot of the German high command had a lot of sickies. Some of them killed themselves. The astonishing number of the high German command had heart attacks. So because they drove themselves so hard. And that was another factor. Anyway, look, Joe, the last thing was, of course, the indictments in 1945, this month in 1945. So 24 Nazi war criminals. I'm going to have to keep it to a word because we are seriously running over time. But, obviously this sets the scene for a groundbreaking seminal development in the way that war is viewed.
Yes. The Nuremberg trials don't begin basically until November 1945. So they're not due to get underway for at least another few weeks. So we'll be covering that in upcoming episodes, but or certainly the beginning of the Nuremberg trials. But the indictments that are handed over to the military tribunal that's selected, and it's an Anglo-French, American, and Soviet affair. Basically, you have a panel of jurors that are assembled, and they are the leading minds. There's a Supreme Court justice, there's a British Chief Justice, or ex-Chief Justice, and there's a Soviet general and whatever, and you have a leading Soviet jurist involved. So it's like top legal minds from all over the Allied sphere are basically brought together. There's two leading legal thinkers. There's a Belgian and a Czechoslovak legal scholar that are basically brought together. They work together as a team, and they basically work out the framework for how these trials are going to run. And the indictments are handed over to the military tribunal on the 18th of October in Berlin, and it's going to happen in Nuremberg. The problem with the indictments is that the indictments were rushed because they couldn't really decide what they were what the charges were going to be. And there's a whole load of issues with regard to, they were charging them with crimes against humanity. The Americans insisted they would pull out of the tribunal if they didn't get their way. The American prosecutor, the key prosecutor, Jackson, insisted that they were charged with crimes against peace. And there was also an insistence that the British wanted to make sure that the Germans would be held to account for basically launching a war of aggression. So a lot of it was to do with how the war was started, German aggression, and basically setting up an international legal platform for basically trying nations that basically were behaving aggressively towards other nations or towards an agglomeration of nations, basically showing aggressive intent combined with basically trying to break the international peace, break the international world order, and then ultimately culminating, which is what the key point of the trial was, with crimes against humanity. The whole thing was kiboshed. A lot of individual leading Nazis, and you've got Himmler. You've got Göring, you've got Jodl, you have Keitel as well. You've got Hess. You've got Admiral Donitz. Several other leading figures, Stryker, all of these leading Nazis, people who were part of Hitler's inner circle, as well as his military elite, and various different figures, industrialists as well, are part of this 24, this lineup of 24 that are going to stand trial on all these charges. But the individual charges that should have been leveled at certain people, including people like Ribbentrop, for instance, this diplomat. And this is going to be the first time that a diplomat, a major European diplomat, is going to be put on trial in this manner and convicted and sentenced to death, which is in some ways a violation of diplomatic immunity. This is going to be groundbreaking stuff. It's going to change how we see, legal codes and how far they can go. The problem is that they're not very effective at drawing up indictments in terms of charging certain individuals within that lineup with specific crimes, because some of them are guilty of worse crimes than others. If you look at Hess, if you look at different other figures, while they are guilty of certain things, they are guilty of far less than people such as Göring or indeed Keitel, who was responsible for the Commando order. And I wanted to just segue to this by saying that in this particular episode of This Week During the Second World War, we mentioned the issuing of the Commando order in 1941. This is the anniversary occurs this week. Keitel is responsible, in cahoots with Hitler, for issuing this directive to the Wehrmacht and to all German forces. And it's actually one of the key things that he's charged with. It's one of the key things that he has to face down during the Nuremberg trials, that the key guilt that he shares, in addition with the use of Wehrmacht units in the murder of Jews in Soviet territory, as well, and in Polish territory as well, basically the murder of Jews in Eastern Europe by Wehrmacht units under effectively Keitel's command, as well as the issuing of the Commando order, are the key things that are seen to be a violation of the rules of war and the code of etiquette by which all military commanders are subject to. And in many respects, what Keitel presides over is basically an order of being, where basically officers who are normally held to a high standard in terms of how they lead their troops and in terms of their military conduct and etiquette, essentially the German officer class, by and large, commit wholesale violations of this throughout the war. And Keitel is held personally responsible by the prosecutors and by the tribunal for having done that. And the Commando order is just one such example. And actually, it comes back to bite them. This order is created in order to essentially punish and effectively torture and murder members of the British Special Forces, Commando forces, that are involved in covert raids behind enemy lines in German occupied territory, destroying military assets and coordinating with resistance units and all other such things. The Commando order ultimately actually leads to the legal basis for the first post-war war crimes trial, which is the Bergen-Belsen trials, because under British law, the indictment had to basically cite the murder of a British subject. And the British subject that was murdered at Bergen-Belsen was a British sailor, who was the last British sailor to be murdered by the Nazi German regime, by the SS, for having taken part in Operation Checkmate, which is a raid on German naval facilities in Norway. And his death at Bergen-Belsen, just very sad, 10 days before Bergen-Belsen was liberated, he was executed. His death, his murder at that camp, for which there were many eyewitnesses, provided the basis in British law for the Bergen-Belsen trials to take place, which was the first of the war crimes trials. So that's a neat little loop in terms of the Commando order and basically post-war war crimes trials, for which I believe the Second World War was a war very much worth fighting. Sorry, Eddie, you're muted.
Okay, Joe, well, that's fantastically detailed. There's so much material that comes up, and I can't control myself. I have to refer to popular culture, which, of course, triggers a lot of interest. People don't realize the connections between films they've seen and the real history. But, Joe, thank you again for another wonderful session. And I'm now just going to wind up. So thanks very much, Joe. Okay, well, there you are, episode 7 of This Week in the Second World War. We covered a lot of ground in some detail. I hope you enjoyed the show. I certainly enjoy listening to Joe's tremendous insights and making connections and discussing things in such detail. We're going to be back next week with another episode of the show, but there's a couple of things I want to share with you that you might want to follow up. On Sunday, there is an online seminar in which there will be a discussion led by Dr. Andrea D'Andrea, who's a professor at Oklahoma State University, about the 45th Thunderbird Division, an American division which recruited mainly from the American Southwest, and it had in its ranks representatives of 50 Native American tribes. And this division landed in Sicily, it fought in Italy, then it went to southern France, and it finished up liberating Dachau. And Dr. Andrea will be discussing this because he's working on the Thunderbird Trail, which is going to put monuments along the whole route that the 45th Division has taken. So that's a live project. It shows you that the Second World War history is not just about looking at the past, it's about doing things now and for the future. So that's on Sunday. If you want to find out more, drop me a note. And I just want to formally announce that the International Second World War History Network second annual conference is now fixed. It's going to be on the 9th of May next year. It's going to be in the London Scottish House as well. We're going to have a wide range of speakers, including Joe Quinn and many others. So if you would like to attend that, admission is free. I'll be putting up the Eventbrite details very soon. Book that. It's admission is free for registered delegates. Anyway, that's it for today. We'll be back next week with an episode, your favorite Second World War history YouTube show. And so until then, from us here, it's goodbye. Good luck, and may God bless you.